Part 1. Rome, a city of opportunity and oddity. When people think of ancient Rome, they often imagine mighty legions marching across Europe, emperors ruling from marble palaces, or grand spectacles at the Colosseum. Rarely does one think of the bustling, messy, and sometimes downright bizarre world of work that made this empire function. Behind the glory of triumphal parades and glittering villas lay a city teeming with tradesmen, hustlers, service providers, and laborers performing jobs that ranged from essential to utterly peculiar. Ancient Rome was, in many ways, the beating heart of the Mediterranean world, a metropolis of over 1 million inhabitants at its peak. Such a vast population required food, entertainment, infrastructure, sanitation, and governance. And so, the city became a place where opportunity flourished, but not always in ways we might consider glamorous or even tolerable today. In this first part of our exploration, we will set the stage for Rome's unusual workforce, delve into the economic and social landscape that made these jobs possible, and begin to uncover some of the more curious professions that kept the Eternal City alive and thriving. The economy of the Eternal City, a web of commerce and survival. To understand why certain strange jobs existed in Rome, one must first grasp the nature of its economy. Rome's wealth was built on conquest and tribute. Plundered riches, enslaved labor, and taxation funded much of its grandeur. Yet, for the average Roman, life was a daily hustle in a bustling urban economy. Markets, or fora, were the lifeblood of the city. These weren't just places to buy grain or olives. They were hubs of gossip, politics, and deal-making. The economy was highly stratified. At the top were senators and equestrians, the elite landowning and merchant classes, while at the bottom toiled slaves, freedmen, and the urban poor. Within this complex system, there existed countless niches, some necessary, others arising purely out of human ingenuity or vice. This environment created a breeding ground for professions that seem outlandish to modern sensibilities. Slavery in the job market. One cannot discuss Roman labor without acknowledging the central role of slavery. Enslaved people performed much of the empire's work, from manual labor to skilled craftsmanship. They were scribes, doctors, tutors, cooks, and gladiators. Yet paradoxically, their widespread presence also created unusual niches for free citizens who needed to find work outside of tasks that slaves dominated. For example, jobs involving personal risk, public humiliation, or questionable morality often fell to free but impoverished Romans seeking survival. These included professions such as public executioners, sewer cleaners, and even professional mourners. While elite Romans might disdain such work, they depended on it nonetheless. Unusual jobs begin. The urban hustle. The city's sheer size meant that some jobs existed purely because of the logistics of urban life. Consider the foolers, professional cleaners who specialized in washing clothes, but they didn't use soap, they used urine, collected from public urinals. Human urine's ammonia content was excellent for whitening togas. Foolers would tread garments in vats of this pungent liquid, a sight and smell all too common in Roman streets. Another peculiar trade was that of the ornatrix or hairdresser for wealthy women. These artisans didn't just curl hair, they constructed elaborate styles towering high with intricate braids and adornments. Some even worked with imported wigs made from Germanic or Indian hair. The job required skill, patience, and the ability to endure the temperamental moods of Roman matrons, who were known to physically strike servants if their coiffures displeased them. Entertainment as employment. Romans adored spectacle, and where there was an audience, there was a job to be found. Beyond the gladiators and charioteers who have become icons of Roman entertainment, there existed a whole ecosystem of lesser-known performers. Take the mimus, for example, a type of comedic performer who would parody everything from politicians to mythological gods. Unlike more formal theater actors, mimuses could be lewd, improvisational, and often shocking. Women could perform in mime acts as well, a rarity in the ancient world. Some mimuses specialized in slapstick violence or crude jokes that would make even a modern stand-up comedian blush. Then there were beast handlers tasked with managing the exotic animals imported for arena games. Lions, elephants, crocodiles, and even hippos were brought to Rome for slaughter or display. These handlers had to keep the animals alive and ferocious until showtime, a dangerous and thankless task that could end in being mauled to death. Religion, superstition, and strange occupations. Religion permeated every aspect of Roman life, creating demand for an array of spiritual specialists. Among them were the haruspices, priests trained to interpret the will of the gods by examining the entrails of sacrificed animals. This gruesome job required not just knowledge of anatomy, but also a knack for convincing clients that a pile of sheep liver held divine secrets. Another curious role was that of the augur, who divined omens by observing the flight patterns of birds. These men held real political power, as no major state action from declaring war to electing officials could proceed without their approval. Yet, beneath the solemnity of their office lay what many modern people would consider pure superstition. On a more dubious end of the spectrum were curse tablet scribes, specialists who inscribed spells of malice on thin sheets of lead. These tablets, often directed against rivals in love or business, were folded and nailed into sacred sites. While illegal, the practice was widespread, and scribes willing to risk divine wrath found steady business, food and drink. Part 2. Work in the shadows. Dirty, dangerous, and downright bizarre. While the streets of Rome gleamed with marble and echoed with the cries of merchants and philosophers, beneath this polished facade lay another world, a darker, grimmer economy that thrived on tasks too vile or dangerous for the noble citizens to consider. Rome's greatness, as magnificent as it appeared, was built upon the labor of those who worked in the shadows, people whose jobs were essential yet despised, vital yet forgotten. In this part, we delve into the strangest, dirtiest, and most dangerous occupations that kept the Roman world functioning. Prepare yourself, for what you are about to read might shake off any romantic notions you had about life in the Eternal City. 1. The Foolers, masters of urine and cloth. When strolling through Rome, you might have seen statues draped in immaculate white togas, a symbol of Roman dignity and virtue. But have you ever wondered how those brilliant whites were achieved in a world without bleach? Enter the fullers, the men who made Roman clothing spotless and whose primary tool was human urine. Public urinals, called piss pots, were set up throughout the city for people to relieve themselves. This waste was collected and brought to the Fulonica, a laundry workshop, where fullers soaked soiled clothes in vats filled with urine. The ammonia helped break down dirt and grease. Workers would then stomp on the clothes, sometimes for hours, in these foul-smelling tubs. Much like a winemaker presses grapes, but far less pleasant. Even Emperor Vespasian recognized the economic potential of this business, introducing the urine tax on public collection points. When criticized for taxing something so base, he famously held up a coin and asked, "Does it smell?" The answer, of course, was no. Thus, Rome's pristine fashion was literally paid for in liquid gold. 2. The night soil men. Rome's human waste handlers. If you thought fullers had a bad job, meet the night soil men, the unsung heroes who managed the city's waste. Rome's famous aqueducts and sewers, like the Cloaca Maxima, could only do so much. Human waste from public latrines often needed manual removal. Armed with buckets and shovels, these laborers descended into the darkness of cesspits and sewer tunnels, wading knee-deep or worse in filth. They worked primarily at night to avoid the stench wafting through the streets by day. It was hazardous work. Toxic gases, sudden floods, and even rats the size of small dogs posed constant threats. Yet, without them, Rome's bustling population would have drowned in its own excrement. 3. Corpse collectors. The necrolepty, death was an omnipresent companion in Rome. From disease to gladiatorial combat, mortality rates were high, and someone had to deal with the aftermath. Enter the necrolepty, the corpse collectors of the city. They patrolled the streets at night, gathering the bodies of the homeless, the executed, or those who died unattended. These remains were dumped into mass graves outside the city walls, considered unclean and cursed. Necrolepty was social outcasts, often forced into the role by poverty or as punishment for crimes. Yet their work was essential. Without them, disease would have swept through the city even faster than it already did. 4. The executioner. Rome's official killer. Though Rome prided itself on law and order, justice in the ancient world was often brutal. The executioner, a figure feared and reviled, carried out state-sanctioned deaths. From simple beheadings to gruesome crucifixions, their methods were as varied as they were horrific. Public executions were entertainment for many Romans, but for the executioner it was an occupation rife with danger, both physical and spiritual. Many Romans believed that spilling blood brought bad luck, so executioners were often segregated from polite society. Despite this, their services were indispensable in maintaining Rome's iron grip over its population. 5. Gladiators, heroes, slaves, and spectacle. Perhaps the most famous job in Rome, though still one of the strangest, was that of the gladiator. While some entered the arena by choice, most were slaves or criminals condemned to fight for their lives. Gladiators trained rigorously in ludi training schools, honing their bodies into weapons. To the public, they were both adored and disposable, celebrated like modern athletes, but always one fight away from death. Winning brought fame, wealth, and even the possibility of freedom. Losing meant humiliation or a violent end. This paradox made gladiators both symbols of Roman power and victims of its cruelty. 6. Beast hunters, venatores of the empire. Rome's appetite for spectacle was insatiable, and exotic animals were essential to its grand games. Lions, tigers, elephants, and even crocodiles graced the arenas, often pitted against gladiators or each other. Procuring these beasts fell to the venatores, skilled hunters who traveled across the empire to capture live animals. It was perilous work. Many died in the process, mauled by their prey or killed by hostile locals. Those who survived returned to Rome with their living trophies, feeding the bloodlust of the Colosseum crowds. 7. Professional mourners, the praefectae. Even death had its performers. In Rome, funerals were public displays of status, and wealthy families hired praefectae, professional mourners, to wail, beat their chests, and sing dirges for the deceased. These women, and sometimes men, were expected to cry dramatically enough to show the community just how loved and important the departed had been. Though the job might seem odd today, it was considered essential for a proper funeral. Without mourners, A Roman might appear unloved in death, a shame worse than dying itself. 8. Tasters. The poison protectors. Roman politics was a deadly game, and poisoning was a common tool of assassination. To safeguard themselves, emperors and wealthy elites employed pregustators, food tasters, who sampled every dish before it reached their master's table, while the pay and proximity to power were tempting. Part 3. Ingenuity and exploitation. Engineering, slavery, and the machinery of empire. If the strange jobs of ancient Rome revealed a society obsessed with control, spectacle, and order, then nowhere was this more evident than in the colossal machinery of empire itself, a system that thrived on innovation but was greased by the suffering of millions. Rome did not merely conquer, it built, transformed, and reshaped the world. Yet, behind every monumental aqueduct, every dazzling bathhouse, every sprawling road that stitched together the provinces of an empire spanning 3 continents, there were countless workers, some free, many enslaved, whose lives were spent in toil. This was the world of Rome's engineers, inventors, and slave laborers, a strange intersection of brilliance and brutality. The engineers, architects of an eternal city. The grandeur of Rome was not accidental. It was planned, calculated, and executed with a level of precision that still astounds modern engineers. But those who oversaw the projects were not merely builders. They were visionaries wielding strange and specific skills. One such job was that of the equerri, the water engineers responsible for managing Rome's lifeblood, its aqueducts. To the average Roman citizen, water flowed freely from fountains and public baths. But behind this convenience lay an intricate network of channels, tunnels, and bridges. Equerri had to maintain constant vigilance, testing water quality, monitoring leaks, and ensuring that sabotage by enemies or disgruntled citizens did not disrupt the city's flow. They even employed plumbery-led pipeworkers who not only installed but routinely repaired Rome's labyrinthine piping. These men, working often in dark, cramped underground spaces, were exposed daily to toxic lead, a job hazard that, ironically, may have contributed to Rome's eventual decline through widespread lead poisoning. Then there were the architecti, Rome's master builders, whose responsibilities went far beyond designing temples or villas. They were tasked with creating amphitheaters capable of holding tens of thousands, constructing roads that could endure centuries of use, and designing siege engines to obliterate enemy fortresses. Their genius lay in blending practicality with grandeur. Yet for all their prestige, even they were not free. From danger, failure to deliver could mean public disgrace, financial ruin, or even execution. The machinery of war. Siege engineers and war technicians. Rome's military dominance was not achieved by brute force alone. It was engineered. Specialized workers known as ballistarii and scorpiones operated and maintained the empire's formidable siege engines, giant crossbows, catapults, and torsion-powered artillery capable of hurling boulders through city walls. These were not ordinary soldiers, they were technicians trained in mathematics, physics, and mechanical construction. However, the job carried risks far beyond the battlefield. These machines were temperamental, their ropes and torsion springs prone to snapping violently. There are accounts of ballistarii losing limbs or their lives when a misfire sent wooden beams whipping back with lethal force. And if a city fell, these men were often the first to face the enemy's vengeance. Slavery, the invisible workforce of innovation. For all the ingenuity of Roman engineering, its foundation rested on human exploitation. Slaves performed the backbreaking labor that made the empire function. They quarried stone for roads and temples, hauled water to construction sites, and dug the massive underground tunnels for aqueducts. Without them, Rome's marvels might never have existed. Particularly grueling were the jobs of forcery, slaves who carried heavy loads of bricks, timber, and marble. Their lives were short and brutal. Injuries were common, and exhaustion often proved fatal. In the mines, conditions were even worse. Roman mines were death traps, operated largely by condemned slaves or prisoners of war. Metallerii, the enslaved miners, extracted the gold, silver, and iron that fueled Rome's economy. They worked in suffocating tunnels, breathing in dust and toxic fumes, often collapsing where they stood. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder described these mines as places where men perish by the thousand, a testament to the inhumanity of Rome's wealth. The innovation of convenience, bathhouse attendants and heating specialists. Roman bathhouses were a symbol of civilization, offering warmth, cleanliness, and socialization. Yet behind their marble floors and steaming pools was a small army of workers. The hypercostarii operated the hypercost system, an ingenious underfloor heating network. Their job was to stoke furnaces continuously, shoveling wood and coal beneath the bathhouse to maintain a constant temperature. They worked in oppressive heat, inhaling smoke and soot, their bodies blackened by years of exposure. Bathhouse attendants, meanwhile, handled everything from oiling patrons' bodies to scraping off sweat and dirt with curved instruments called strigils. While some enjoyed tips from wealthy clients, others endured abuse and assault from drunken bathers. Entertainment engineering. The makers of spectacle. Rome's obsession with entertainment created unique technical professions. The machinators were stage engineers responsible for the elaborate machinery of the Colosseum, hidden trapdoors, elevators that raised wild beasts from underground cages, and complex pulley systems that could transform the arena floor into a mock naval battlefield. This was high-risk, high-pressure work. A malfunction could ruin an emperor's carefully planned games, and failure in front of tens of thousands of spectators could mean death. It is said that during one infamous event, when the mechanism to flood the Colosseum for a naval battle failed, the entire team of machinators was executed as an example. Part 4. The fall of the workers' decline, transformation, and legacy. The story of Roman labor is not one of static tradition but of a long arc bending toward transformation, collapse, and reinvention. The vast network of strange and specialized jobs that once powered the empire eventually unraveled under the weight of changing economies, invasions, and the collapse of centralized authority. This final chapter traces that decline, examines what became of those trades, and explores how their legacy endures in ways we might not expect. The cracks in the empire, economic shifts, and the dwindling demand for labor. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire had begun to creak under immense pressures. Inflation soared as debased currency flooded the markets. Trade routes that had once stretched securely from Britain to the Euphrates became perilous. Cities that had thrived under Roman administration began to wither as provincial wealth drained away to pay for endless wars and the bloated military. Jobs that had once been vital to the urban experience started disappearing. The equerry water engineers found their work disrupted as aqueducts fell into disrepair in frontier cities. Without steady tax revenue, municipalities could no longer afford to maintain these vast infrastructure projects. Similarly, Fallone's launderers and papery purple dye makers struggled as trade in luxury goods waned. Without the influx of exotic dyes from the east, their crafts lost value. Moreover, as the empire faced repeated barbarian incursions, rural life became increasingly isolated and self-sufficient. Urban-dependent jobs, gladiator trainers, tavern entertainers, bathhouse attendants dwindled as urban centers shrank and became ghost towns. The strange variety of professions that characterized Rome's peak gave way to a grimmer subsistence-based economy. 2. The transformation of slavery and the rise of serfdom. One of the most significant labor shifts of late antiquity was the transformation of slavery itself. At the height of the empire, Rome's economy relied heavily on slaves captured in war. They were everywhere, in households, fields, workshops, and even administrative offices. But as Rome ceased its territorial expansion, this steady influx of slaves declined. To compensate, landowners bound tenant farmers, known as coloni, to the land. These individuals were not slaves in the traditional sense. They could not be bought or sold individually. But they were no freer in practice. Their obligations to their landlords were perpetual, and their descendants inherited the same burden. This proto-feudal system foreshadowed medieval serfdom and marked the end of Rome's flexible labor market. Many trades shifted to reflect this new reality. Specialized urban crafts declined, replaced by generalized rural labor. The leather worker who once made gladiatorial armor might now be a simple village cobbler. The professional venators, beast hunters for the amphitheater, disappeared entirely as gladiatorial games were banned in the 5th century CE by Christian emperors who considered them barbaric. 3. The Christianization of work and the moral recasting of labor. The rise of Christianity dramatically altered attitudes toward work. Pagan Rome often regarded labor, especially manual labor, as something for slaves and the lower classes. The elite prided themselves on living off land rents and avoiding vulgar toil. Christianity, however, brought a theological shift. Labor became a moral duty, a means of serving God. This ideological change reshaped many professions. The once celebrated flamens and august priests of the old gods vanished, replaced by Christian clergy who preached humility and service. Public entertainments like chariot racing and gladiatorial combat, once major industries employing thousands, faced increasing criticism and eventual abolition. Yet Christianity also preserved certain Roman professions by recontextualizing them. Scribal work, for example, evolved from a bureaucratic necessity into a religious calling. As monks painstakingly copied texts in monasteries, physicians, once reliant on temple patronage, found new legitimacy in Christian hospitals. Even engineering, though diminished, survived in the service of church construction. For the barbarian takeover, what was lost and what endured. When Germanic tribes such as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths swept across the empire in the 5th century, they didn't entirely destroy Roman labor systems, they transformed them. Cities shrank, but they did not vanish. Aqueducts crumbled, yet some were maintained for centuries. Roads deteriorated, but the routes themselves remained essential arteries of movement for medieval kingdoms. Certain professions adapted to these new realities. The Ferrari blacksmiths, for instance, continued to thrive as weapon makers for barbarian warlords. Farmers remained indispensable, though their practices became less sophisticated without the Roman network of grain supply and distribution. Other trades, however, were extinguished. The exotic animal traders who once filled the Colosseum with lions and elephants had no purpose in a world without amphitheaters. The perfume makers of